He stood in a gym that didn't know his name yet. Louisville was behind him now, not in distance. Distance was just miles, but in something heavier. The gym on West Main, the faces that had watched him since he was 12, the voice of his father echoing through small rooms, the street corners where everyone knew exactly who Cassius Clay was supposed to be. All of it, behind him. Miami didn't care who he'd been yesterday. Miami wanted to know what he could do tomorrow. The air felt different here, hotter, wetter, pressing against skin instead of just surrounding it. The gym smelled like leather worn smooth by 10,000 punches, sweat that never quite dried, disinfectant failing to cover blood, and tape adhesive. But the rhythm was faster. Fighters moved with purpose, not patience. Trainers barked instructions in businesslike tones, voices of men who'd seen too many promising kids fail. No one lingered, no one wasted motion. In Louisville, boxing had been a way up. Here, it was business, product. You delivered or you disappeared. Cassius watched them work. Watched how they moved, how they held themselves between rounds, how they carried the weight of knowing that being good wasn't enough anymore. You had to be marketable. You had to sell. A welterweight in the corner threw combinations with mechanical precision, face blank, eyes fixed on nothing. A heavyweight worked the bag with methodical brutality. These weren't fighters dreaming of glory. These were professionals calculating margins. He'd won his first professional fight 2 months ago. 6 rounds, a decision, clean, controlled, exactly the kind of debut that opened doors. The local papers called it promising. His father called it careful, which wasn't a compliment, but standing here in this new city, that win felt small, felt like something that had happened to a different person. It had been enough for Louisville. It wouldn't be enough for what came next. At 19, he'd made a choice most fighters never had to make: leave home while it still felt like home. His mother had cried, not loudly, but in that quiet, persistent way that stayed in your chest. She'd folded his shirts with trembling hands, refolding them when they were already perfect. His father had nodded, hands tightening on the arms of his chair, jaw working around words he wouldn't say. The house had felt smaller that last week. They understood, or told themselves they understood. But understanding didn't make the silence at dinner less heavy, didn't make his mother's eyes any less red when she thought he wasn't looking. His younger brother asked when he'd come back. Cassius said soon, knowing it was a lie. The neighborhood reacted differently. Some nodded with approval. Others saw abandonment. Old men at the barbershop stopped mid-conversation when he walked by. Former sparring partners looked elsewhere. The unspoken accusation, "You think you're better than this now?" The city itself pressed differently here. Louisville had rules, old, familiar, predictable. You knew where you could walk, what looks meant, what silence cost. You knew which water fountains were yours and which weren't. The segregation was brutal but legible. Miami had rules too, but they shifted. The same segregation, different enforcement. The beach was white. The gyms were mixed but tense. Restaurants downtown had hierarchies he was still learning. Some places served you. Some made you wait until every white customer was satisfied. Some looked through you like glass. He'd have to learn them all over again. Had to figure out which battles were worth fighting and which would just burn time. In Louisville, he'd known instinctively when to push back. Here, every interaction carried risk. He'd arrived with one suitcase and a handful of promises, a contact at a gym, a trainer people said was worth the move, a chance to work with fighters who'd already been where he wanted to go. No guarantees, no contracts, just the thin hope that leaving everything behind would turn into something more than regret. Angelo Dundee didn't look like much at first glance. Mid-40s, average height, calm, not loud, not flashy. He watched Cassius work the bag that first day and said almost nothing, just nodded occasionally, eyes tracking every movement. Cassius expected questions about Louisville, about his record. Instead, Dundee just watched, studying, reading something Cassius couldn't name yet. When Dundee finally spoke, it wasn't praise. "You move fast," he said, "but you move sloppy when you get excited. You drop your hands when you're winning. You lean forward when you should slide back. You want to finish before the opening's there. And your footwork falls apart in the fourth round because you're burning energy you do not need to burn." Cassius had heard criticism before. Every trainer criticized. But this felt different. It wasn't judgment. It was observation. Dundee wasn't trying to tear him down. He was naming things that were already true, things Cassius had felt but hadn't been able to fix. The training changed immediately, faster, sharper, less forgiving. Dundee didn't care about power. He cared about control, about distance, maintaining it, manipulating it, making opponents think they were close when they were still out of range, about timing measured in fractions of seconds. "Flash gets you attention," Dundee said one afternoon, after Cassius threw a dazzling combination that left him exposed. "Control wins fights. Attention gets you paid. Control keeps you conscious. You need both, but you need to know which one matters when." They worked on defense until Cassius's shoulders burned, head movement until his neck screamed, footwork until his calves cramped. Dundee didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. Every drill had a purpose, every correction built on the last. Nothing was wasted. Slowly, something shifted. The wildness that had made him exciting started to harden into something refined. His hands stayed higher, his weight stayed centered. His breathing stayed controlled, even in later rounds. He started to see openings before they appeared, started to feel when an opponent was about to commit, based on nothing more than a subtle shoulder shift. He was learning to fight like engineers built bridges, with precision, calculation, understanding that every unnecessary movement added risk. The other fighters noticed. Some respected it, but others resented it. A 19-year-old kid with one fight getting Dundee's time, getting opportunities they'd fought years to earn. They'd paid dues, they'd bled. And here was Cassius Clay, young and fast and unmarked, getting fast-tracked. The gym wasn't hostile, but it wasn't welcoming. No one helped, no one shared shortcuts. When Cassius asked questions, answers came slowly, stripped of useful detail. When he made mistakes, laughter lingered too long. He trained in focused isolation, surrounded by people who didn't believe he belonged. One afternoon, a middleweight named Rodriguez, who'd been fighting professionally for 6 years, stopped to watch Cassius spar. When the round ended, Rodriguez walked over. "You got speed," he said. Not a compliment, but speed without discipline just means you hit air faster. You want to last, you better learn when not to throw. Cassius nodded. Didn't argue, just listened. Rodriguez studied him, then nodded once and walked away. Not friendship, but not contempt either. Acknowledgement. And in a gym like this, acknowledgement had to be earned. At night, alone in a rented room 3 blocks from the beach, the weight settled differently. The room was small, clean enough. A bed, a chair, a window facing a street he was still learning. No family dinners. No familiar voices through thin walls. No corner store where the man behind the counter knew his name. Just silence. Traffic that never stopped. The ocean in the distance. The ceiling fan clicking. And the awareness that he'd chosen this. That going back wasn't an option, even if staying felt unbearable, even if some nights the loneliness pressed against his chest, hard enough to make breathing feel like work. He'd call home on Sundays. His mother would ask if he was eating enough, sleeping enough, staying safe. Cassius would say yes to all of it, would paint progress and opportunity, would leave out the parts about eating alone, lying awake wondering if he'd made a mistake. He missed Louisville in ways he couldn't explain to anyone. Not the place itself. Miami had better gyms, better opportunities, better fighters who could teach him things Louisville never could. But he missed being known, missed walking into a room and having people already understand who he was, what he'd done, where he'd come from. Missed the comfort of familiar faces, even when those faces came with judgments and expectations and limits. Here, he was starting over. building from nothing, proving himself to people who had no reason to care and even less reason to make it easy. Every morning felt like an audition. Every sparring session felt like a test he might still fail. He missed Louisville in ways he couldn't explain. Not the place itself. Miami had better gyms, better opportunities. But he missed being known, missed walking into a room and having people already understand who he was. Here he was starting over. Every morning felt like an audition. Every sparring session felt like a test. But that absence created something unexpected. Freedom. Not the loud kind, the quiet, unsettling kind. The kind that woke you up at 3 in the morning with the realization that no one was watching anymore. No one was judging. The freedom to decide each day who he was becoming. No one here remembered him at 12, throwing wild punches because anger was easier than fear. No one here had expectations shaped by his father's voice or his neighborhood's limits. He could be anyone, could rebuild himself, could keep what worked and discard what didn't, could experiment with ways of moving, ways of talking, ways of presenting himself that would have felt impossible back home. It was terrifying, it was liberating, often both at once. The work became everything. Mornings at the gym, afternoons running along the beach, sand pulling at his legs, sun hammering his shoulders. Evenings watching film, studying fighters Dundee thought he needed to understand. He learned to see things he'd never noticed before. How great fighters set traps 3 punches ahead, how they controlled rhythm, how they made opponents fight their fight without the opponent ever realizing it. Slowly, the other fighter's resentment shifted. Not into friendship. Professional respect doesn't require friendship, but into acknowledgement. He wasn't just fast anymore. He was learning to be precise, learning to be patient, learning to fight smart, not just hard. Dundee never complimented him directly. But one afternoon, after a sparring session where Cassius had controlled every round without taking a single clean shot, Dundee nodded once and said, "That's it. That's what it looks like." It wasn't much, but it was everything. 3 months after arriving in Miami, Cassius understood something he couldn't have understood in Louisville. Talent wasn't enough. Wins weren't enough. You had to become someone people couldn't ignore, someone who demanded attention not through volume, but through undeniable skill. You had to make them remember your name, not because you told them to, but because forgetting you became impossible. He was still 19, still learning, still figuring out how much of himself he'd need to sacrifice to become what he wanted to be. But Louisville felt farther away now. Not gone, never gone, but distant enough that he could see it clearly for the first time, could see what it had given him and what it couldn't give him anymore. The gym on the beach didn't know his name yet, but it would. Miami didn't care who he'd been yesterday. But tomorrow was coming, and when it arrived, Cassius Clay would be ready. Not the fighter Louisville had shaped, the fighter he'd chosen to become. And that choice, made alone in a city that didn't owe him anything, changed everything that followed.